Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today I would like to continue on with our discussion of some of those horror films in my life that, for one reason or another, I have very fond memories of. And this is one of them. It is from a series of films that has had a big impact on me as a horror film fan. I've already spoken about The Omen, spoken a little bit about Damien Omen 2, and now let me speak a little bit about the 1981 film, which is called The Final Conflict. The Final Conflict is here. This is the Blu-ray, and it's taken, of course, from this absolutely splendid Blu-ray set Region A from Scream Factory, which has the Omen films in it. It's highly recommended if you can get this. What a great set. And if you like the Omen films, this is, I think, essential. But we have here the third film, The Final Conflict. I love that the film is titled The Final Conflict. It's not called Omen 3, The Final Conflict. And I seem to recall that always left me, when I was a kid growing up, I admit, it left me a little bit confused as to what this was. But at the same time, that confusion led to further fascination about it. Oh yeah, it's called The Final Conflict, but it's really the third, it's Omen 3. Wow, isn't that cool? So that kind of reputation grew in my mind about this film. And there was something almost very elusive about the film to me as a kid, because I felt as a kid growing up, 6, 7, 8 years old, that some of the elements and plot narrative strands that we saw hinted at in, say, Omen and Damien Omen 2 were things that maybe were in the background. In particular, Damien Omen 2 deals with a lot of corporate intrigue, and I admit that I wasn't quite keeping up with what those plot elements were and how they had an impact and what their significance was in Damien Omen 2. As I got older, I was able to follow along, but when I was a kid, I wasn't able to follow along at all. But still, I thought there was something really cool, and maybe this was something of the grown-up world that I wasn't able to understand at the time. That stuff is further explored in The Final Conflict in a very interesting way. Again, a lot of the stuff with Thorn Industries is sometimes in the foreground, but a lot of times in the background. So it's a further augmentation, if you will, of the kind of treatment of this corporate intrigue stuff that we saw in Damien Omen 2. So it's furthered along, I think, quite nicely in The Final Conflict. But that's not the main part of the story, of course, because the main part of the story is now a grown-up Damien. And he is powerful, he is suave, he is charismatic, and he is very dangerous, and he knows what his destiny is. And he's in a very powerful position. And so this sets the stage for what will be, I think, a very intriguing type of conflict, if you will, between the forces of good and the forces of evil. Set up, I think, in a very nuanced way, and in a very unexpected way as well. What I like about this film, very much so, is that it has so many plot strands that are combined in one film, and a lot of them are quite spectacular. And so I explained here the corporate intrigue stuff, the adult Damien Thorn, and then we have the story about the priests, and the story about the second coming, and then the story about the children. And there's a really creepy, sinister, terrible part of the really horrific part of the narrative that is introduced here, involving children. And I think, in my eyes, it's probably the most horrific part of any Omen film It's included in this. It's quite nasty what happens and what transpires here, and so that leads also to the overall impact of the film, right? When it's very unforgettable. So my point is that there are a lot of elements that are combined, I think, quite effectively, and that makes the proceedings very fresh. And when one plot element seems to have resolved itself, we go along to another plot element. And I think the progression, it feels very good and swift on the one hand, but also it feels very organic on the other, because there is this sense of prophecy, and there's a sense of fate that introduces new elements, but also this sense of prophecy and fate is something that is we are accustomed to as fans and watchers of the Omen films, because we've seen this sense of prophecy and fate carried through the first two films quite poetically. And so my point is that there is a real nice sense of continuity that is established in this film, and therefore it feels like its own thing on the one hand, and yet it feels very organically part of a larger whole on the other, which I think is really great, one of the great strengths, I think, of the Omen films. I understand the continuity is not perfect; it's not absolutely perfect in all places, but I think for the most part, the continuity in the world that's being created in these three films, I think the filmmakers have done the world a lot of justice, and they've respected the rules that they've set up. Again, there are some minor points that I could quibble about, but I think the overall effect is quite marvelous, and as I say, very organic, and I really admire that and appreciate that. But at the same time, it's still its own entity, its own thing, the film, The Final Conflict, which is also quite wonderful. There is a sense of a spectacle, a horror spectacle, and what I really appreciate about the Omen films is that each horror spectacle set piece feels different from what happened before. We saw a lot of this, in The Omen. We saw a lot of this in Damien Omen 2, and I would suggest too that we see a lot of this in The Final Conflict. Each spectacle set piece feels different from what came before and what comes after, and so I really like this attempt at trying to maintain a freshness, and that leaves us with a sense of surprise and also a sense of suspense, not quite knowing what will happen next. Also, I love how, well, actually, let me take this back. When I was a kid, one of the things I would admit really, really disappointed me about this film is, and I'll try to be as vague as possible, one of the things that disappointed me was how the film, how should I put it, the film and the way it leads to its conclusion. The fact that it's called The Final Conflict, I always thought we would be having this huge kind of battles or some kind of large-scale stuff that could happen. But on the contrary, what we have in The Final Conflict, and again I'll try to be as vague as possible, is something that is a confrontation, but on a much seemingly quieter and more intimate scale. And so we don't have many players being involved in the final conflict per se, but directly speaking, we have only a limited number of people involved. And I admit I always was struggling with that aspect of this film, and it always disappointed me that we didn't get this final battle between good and evil on a large epic scale. That had always disappointed me. But as I got older and I watched this film more and more, I came to the conclusion that I think the intimate, quiet way that the film reaches its conclusion, shall we say, is still, I think, I realize, is very effective, and it is in keeping with the harmony of what we have seen in the past films. In all the past films, even where grand, ambitious schemes on a global scale have been hinted at, we have never been privy to those. We have always seen the story through the eyes of these characters, and therefore all the set pieces and all the horrific stuff and all the key landmark moments of the film, including the final conflict, have always been from the viewpoint of the characters. Thus, they have always been placed in this setting of an intimate scale. Intimacy, say, in terms of character interactions and a set number of characters and their reactions to a particular set of circumstances that arise at a given point in time, right? That has always been the case with all the Omen films. And so, the way that the final conflict resolves itself, I think, is, now that I realize it, it is in keeping, absolutely in keeping with the spirit and tenor and the philosophy, if you will, of the way in which events and ideas are presented in the films of the Omen franchise. And so I really like the way, I love the way, in fact, that the film resolves itself now, which is a differing view than what I had when I was much younger. And also, again, without saying too much, it really emphasizes the notion of parents and children. And I always forget this, but throughout the entire films, the theme of parents and children, this is one of the key elements of the film, and this is one of this is the key element because it's the source of the greatest tension, dramatic tension in all the films, I would argue, namely the idea of the bond between a parent and a child, but also the horror that can arise due to the fact that we have such an intimate relationship between a parent and a child. So the bond and then the horror, this collision, I think, is the heartbeat of the films, The Omen, the Damien Omen 2, and the final conflict. And even though we have a grown-up Damien, we still have issues in terms of his parentage, shall we say. And then also we have other parent-child relationships in this film that I think are very significant. And they are paralleled very beautifully and quite poetically. So that is to say that in the long run, I think this film is incredibly effective. It is probably, for me, the film that it feels like, how should I put it? It's the one that I've had to come around the most on. Because, as I indicated, there were some elements of disappointment that I felt when I was a kid, but I came around to them growing up until now. And so I think it's to me, is it my favorite of the three? It's hard to say, but I think it's really quite splendid. It is helped, of course, by the epic music by Jerry Goldsmith. And I mentioned this when I was talking about The Omen and Damien Omen 2. The Omen music is classic, iconic. You think perhaps there's no way that he could top that. And then with Damien Omen 2, he seems to go in a completely unexpected direction. Jerry Goldsmith, I mean, in terms of a different way, a different beat. And it feels similar, but still distinctly on its own. And I love the score for it. And then we go to the final conflict, which, again, he takes another turn. This is now the triumphant, the majestic almost. The idea that, it's almost the theme of goodness, as it were. And there's still some sinister elements to it. The layering, the complexity is marvelous. I mentioned this earlier, but the multifaceted approach that Jerry Goldsmith has with all the scores, the classical instruments, the classical music approach to it on the one hand, and yet there's some electronic beats that are quirky and eerie, that are interspersed throughout. I love it, absolutely love it. This score, The Final Conflict, it has connections, but it's also its own thing. It's certainly its own thing. It has its own theme and its own character and tenor. Oh my goodness. What a great way to show us how to score 3 separate films in a trilogy. They are all related, of course, but then they are all separate and different. My goodness, this sense of freshness that we have with the musical scores alone in this trilogy of films is remarkable. And the Final Conflict score is, as I say, majestic, grand, ambitious, and wholly beautiful. My goodness, what a great score it is. And let me just take a step back and conclude, if I may, about the final conflict and the cycle of 3 films as well. This film, The Final Conflict, as I was trying to describe it, has many elements bunched into it. I feel like it's amazingly has related themes and it feels organic with the first 2 films, but it's its own thing. The way it approaches violence, the way it approaches these storylines, Damien is in a different point in his life, of course, and I think that adds to the effectiveness of the feeling of being set off from the rest of the films. But still there's a related plot thread, of course, not least of which being Damien Thorn himself. And so I love this about these films. You know, they each have their own sense of tenor and place. I'm sure fueled in large part by the fact that we have different directors and different approaches at play. But more or less we have the same through line. There is a same tenor of character on the one hand, but yet they're all organically intertwined and related on the one hand. But on the other hand, they each are their own separate thing, and they're focusing in on the particular point in time of this particular character that we have come to recognize and know. That is the character of Damien Thorn. So I love that about this series. I love how it's organic as a whole, and yet they are all distinctly standing on their own. And The Final Conflict is no exception to that. I think it stands so firmly on its own. It has a lot of great strengths to it, a lot of really creepy moments to it, and a lot of horrific moments. As I indicated, there's one particular plot element that is, I think, the most horrific aspect of the entire film series. Really horrific. And the places that it goes are just, simply put, quite shocking. But it presents these ideas still in a way that it doesn't go overboard in terms of the on-screen violence, I think. I mean, there are some really horrific violent parts to it, but I don't think it doesn't go overboard with some scenes which could have entered into the realm of offensive even, but it doesn't go that road, I would agree. I would argue. But rather, it has horrific elements to its plot, but it's presenting them in a way that is still in keeping with the films that came before it. So this is, I think, a worthy almost conclusion, if you will, to the cycle of films in what was known as the Omen trilogy. That is, of course, before we had the other films that came along subsequently. But in the meantime, of course, we have this film, The Final Conflict, which I think is a really worthy conclusion to the storyline that we saw set up in The Omen and then Damien Omen 2. This is The Final Conflict. And of course, I should say, please forgive me for not mentioning it, but now let me just say before I forget, Sam Neill's performance. The performances are really fantastic in this film, but Sam Neill as Damien, wow, what a performance this is. It's grand, it's over the top, it's muted in some places where it has to be, but then it just goes for it when it needs to, and it's just loud and bombastic, and it's so arrogant and so vile. Perfect stuff. And there's something about Sam Neill and his performances and the way he smiles. Whenever he smiles, it's perfect. He's able to capture that sense of charm, wit, and sinister evil, and almost it's this sense of self-awareness, like he's almost in on the joke kind of thing, and a softness and also sharp clarity. And you don't know if he's being sincere, if he's really masking his true intentions. And of course, this can go on, and it's all in that subtle way that he smiles. What a great performance! What a great example of a great performance Sam Neill provides in a film that is filled with great performances, in a cycle of films that have all great performances. My goodness, what a great film this is in a great trilogy of films. This is The Final Conflict. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you once again for your time, my dear friends, and Cheers.